Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to the September 25th workshop of the Oshkosh Common Council. This is the third in the series of workshops we're having regarding the budget for 2014. This one's going to focus on the CIP, which will also maybe even beyond a little bit beyond 2014. The council has really a series. We have 3 more scheduled after this, a couple in October, 1 in November. And the council, if it was like last year, could end up scheduling more workshops after that. So we have a lot of workshops because we have a tough budget ahead of us. We're trying to work through this methodically and work with as much information and as much knowledge as we can. I'm going to turn the microphone over to City Manager, Mr. Roloff, and you probably want to introduce.
Yes,
if you would.
I'll start with introductions. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My pleasure to introduce to you Ed Noakes. Ed is our interim finance director. He's also our previous past finance director. Ed was a finance director for the city for, I believe, 29 years, and Peggy replaced him back in 2008. Ed's agreed to help us out during this transition period, and appreciate some of it was old home week, and some of it was refreshing old memories. As we were preparing for tonight, I talked about a few things and brought back some memories to him, and other things have changed. And I think Ed will be a good resource for us and assist with the transition. Most of the folks downstairs in finance are worked for Ed previously, so appreciate having Ed on board. And if you don't have had a chance to meet him already, if you just want to say hi to him later on, that'd be great. Tonight is, as the mayor said, is the third in our series of presentations on sort of pre-budget workshops. That's why there's no pizza tonight. There was a question about pizza this evening, but where the budget's not issued yet, so we don't have the pizza. I think what probably threw people off is that we do have a preliminary capital improvement program for 2014 to 2018. The reason that you have this earlier is I've been trying to evolve the capital improvement program into the CIP document into really a planning document before it becomes a budget document. And I think we achieved that a little more this year. I'd still like to have it even earlier so that it becomes more of a planning tool than a budget tool. It does effectively become a budget tool later on, but the whole idea is to get some planning foresight to this. This document was presented to the Plan Commission last month, and they did recommend approval to it. They're required by law to approve the capital improvement plan for its consistency with the comprehensive plan. They do not look at it as a financing mechanism. For that reason, the document that you had delivered to you last week differed slightly from what the Plan Commission had. The section on capital equipment was excluded from the what we gave the Plan Commission, because that's traditionally not something that is in a capital improvement plan. For those of you who have been on the Long Range Finance Committee, you've had that discussion for a number of times. I didn't think it was appropriate or even necessary to give that to the Plan Commission, but it is in this document for the Council, because when it becomes a budget issue, it is very much an issue for the Council. The capital improvement plan is really, for purposes of this discussion, is really an issue of debt. And I want to get into a discussion of capital improvements, transition it to debt, because really that's what we are ultimately going to circle back to when all is said and done. I have a brief PowerPoint presentation. I don't know if this one's going to necessarily run a full 2 hours, but the discussion could go on and on. Some council members have contacted me with some supplemental information. I have the PowerPoint. I would just suggest that you follow this. The other handouts I gave you are supplemental to the PowerPoint, and we'll get to those as we get on. I wanted to have some of that information to you prior to the meeting, but it really flows from the presentation I have for you. So with respect to the workshop, what I thought I'd do is the capital improvement document on the very front has a lot of different categories, and these are the categories that we have for the capital improvement program. They run from very complex comprehensive street utility improvements. Those are when we completely redo a street from the utilities way at the bottom all the way to the street. And then we have a bunch of other categories with all of our utilities, stormwater, sanitary sewer and water, as well as some minor categories like traffic, parks, sidewalks, things of that nature. And then we do have major equipment in here. That is something that I can't say is unique to Oshkosh, but it's something that has become a reality here and in many other communities using the capital improvement program, or in reality, debt financing to fund large capital equipment purchases. And I'll get into that a little later. And then lastly, tax increment finance district improvements that are funded by tax increment financing, but in reality, there is an impact on general obligation borrowing, particularly the situation we're in today. So I'm going to get into all those as we go through this, but these are the general categories. The very first page summarizes all these improvements, and there's a summary. Each section starts on a separate page. It wasn't my intent to go through the projects tonight, although I did ask Mr. Potik to be here just in case, because Public Works is clearly far and away the largest chunk of these improvements. But there are others. But Mr. Potik's here tonight to answer questions if there are anything about these projects. I think the real issue, if you do talk to Mr. Potik, you probably want to have a discussion about what things fall off, which priorities are there, because as we will see later on, it really comes down to the availability of funds. So those are the categories.
Mark, let me just mention something briefly here. All the microphones are on, so everybody, if you have questions to ask, I assume they can ask them as they go along. So just ask your questions. So just go ahead and ask if you have a question at some point.
Can you close the door behind you? The sun is.
Oh, I can certainly do that.
Actually, it's the aura coming from this side of the table.
Just the glare off in my head. That's okay.
Thank you.
Well, I was looking for a ray of sunshine with this discussion. Okay.
Boy.
Whenever a department submits a request for a capital improvement, they identify the funding sources. And I think this pretty much covers the universe of funding sources that we have with this slide. I can't say that all of them are used. In fact, I would say some of them in many categories are not used, and maybe they should be. The very first one, the annual general fund tax levy, we really haven't been using that. I like to refer to that as the down payment. If you're buying a car, do you put a down payment on it? Do you pay with cash, or do you borrow the whole thing? We don't put a lot of annual levy into our capital improvements, but that's certainly something that could be done. Developer contributions, we haven't had a lot of those in recent years because we haven't had a lot of new developments. That's typically when you see to that. The most common one, the one we're going to talk about the most tonight, is general obligation debt, bonds or notes. Bonds are debt that's financed typically, in our case, for 20 years. Notes are 10 years. And typically that is based on what the life of the improvement is. And when I say improvement, I use that term very loosely because that can be capital equipment that has a useful life of more than 10 years. Special assessments, that's something that we have relied on heavily, particularly for our street program. And Council's been very supportive of following through with our special assessment policy. State, federal grants or funds, when we get them, we certainly appreciate those. The ones that we've probably taken most advantage of in recent years has been for the Riverwalk. Occasionally, there's some funding at the state level, a program known as the Local Road Improvement Program. Periodically, we get funding from there. At the federal level, there's federal aid to urban highways, or whatever we call it nowadays, Dave. I can't remember what the term is, but it's a federal program that we get an allocation periodically. Joint funding with other agencies, that depends on what's going on. A good example was Poperesny Road last year. We participated with the town of Nakaimai and the DOT to get Poperesny Road done because it was done, the road is actually in two different jurisdictions, so cooperative project there. Utility funds are probably the next largest funding source, either through user fees or utility debt, revenue bonds, or notes. Tax increment funds, tax increment does fund a great deal of capital improvements, but you always have to put the asterisk there because a lot of times it has to get funded through debt, and the debt that is issued for tax increment bonds is really general obligation debt. There is such a thing as tax increment revenue debt. It's not considered a very reliable source. I don't necessarily show it here. It exists. I don't think we've ever used it here. I've never used it in my career just because it is very, the revenue debt for that is not considered as reliable, so we don't use that. But if we have tax increment funds, we'll try to fund things as we go on. And then an offshoot of tax increment funds is donor TIF funds. For us, our by far our most successful TIF has been tax increment district number 7. That's served as a donor TIF for a variety of projects. Mr. Davis is looking at potential opportunities to use TIF 7 before it closes out for some other donor TIF opportunities, be it primarily for the riverfront, but other projects that may be appropriate. We don't like to use it a lot, but when we have a successful TIF, as successful as TIF 7, sometimes you want to go to that trough because it's such a wonderful financing mechanism. So that's kind of the universe of the funds that are there. Now that makes it seem like we've got all these funding sources, but in reality, it gets simplified as we get limited in how we can use those.
Mark, just stopping there, the annual general fund tax levy, which we don't
use.
access now, that could be that, I don't remember the exact figure, but that $14 to $16 million of possible levy that we could go at or add to the levy this year, correct, based on one of our previous meetings?
I want to make sure I'm answering your question. Are you talking about some of the TIFs getting closed?
No, this was just that when we did the analysis of where the levy actually is and what we could
Our levy
actually go to
capacity.
our levy capacity.
Yeah.
So this could be, that extra levy capacity could be used, would be a possible source for this.
Yeah, that's very true. You had that discussion. We talked about what your real allowable tax levy ability is, and we aren't tapping into it because of the way the law is written. We do have some flexibility there. That really, it comes back to what is tolerable from a political standpoint with your constituents. So, yeah, that is something that's a very valuable option. Now we get to a little bit of reality, and I just titled this one "Cash or Credit," because in practice, unless funds are direct expenditure offsets, meaning developer contributions or something like that, or cash, like Tom just mentioned, the city has to fund the project until actual revenues are realized. A couple of examples here, special assessments. Property owners have 15 years to repay. So when we give them 15 years to repay, we're fronting the money because the contractor is getting paid that day. There was some discussion at the last workshop we had. The auditors were here, brought to the council's attention an issue that we've been working on, catching up on some old special assessments. I think we're caught up on all of them except for some DOT projects and the current year, obviously. We're still working on the current year, but we're almost caught up on that. But that has created a cash flow pinch for us, and I think we're improving in that area. But when you have 15 years to repay, you have to finance it until such time as the residents pay it off. Mr. Noak's experience in this is we've used our special assessments to kind of be a self-funding mechanism, but as we accelerate the use of special assessments, we can get into a cash flow pinch. We've typically not borrowed for the special assessments. We've sort of allowed current revenues to pay for obligations going on, but periodically, we haven't done it during the time Peggy was here because we never got to that point, but Mr. Noakes pointed out that what we had done in the past was we sort of caught up the special assessment fund with a little bit more borrowing until the revenues from some special assessments started to roll in, because after a while, if people do select the 15-year option, it does create a cash flow pinch for us. We haven't done it in the last, I don't know if you even remember when the last time we borrowed when you were here, but it was probably
Back in the 90s.
Back in the 90s, so periodically we have to do it. We may need to do some catch-up provisions there. So it doesn't happen often, but periodically.
But will we know that before going into our budget this year? Because aren't most of the people supposed to send their information back by now?
It's not an issue that, I think what we need to do is we need to do for lack of a better term, a full-blown audit of the special assessment fund to see where we are, to see if we do need to go and do some extra borrowing. It will create a pinch, as you see later on, because we do have some debt capacity issues that I'll get into a little later. But if the special assessment fund gets into a pinch, as it has in the past, we catch up. Some communities, and this is what I've done before, is you borrow for every special assessment you issue. So, for example, what was it? There was about $1 million that we, or no, what was the amount we for Keenville? How much did we special assess for a project like that? Wasn't a lot. 100,000.
Yeah, 100, 150.
Okay, for example, a small project like that, $150,000. Other communities I've been in, I would borrow that $150,000 right up front. And then as people paid it off, we would simply pay that debt off. If people paid in early, we would reserve those funds for payback and then pay it back as the debt came due. Or if we had the ability to pay it off early, we would pay it off early. We've tried to create sort of a self-funding mechanism for that with periodic borrowings after the fact. That's something we're going to have to take a look at and, for lack of a better term, audit it. I had to audit funds in the past, even when I borrowed in advance, and let it pay off, just to make sure I wasn't collecting too much money. In this case, do we have some sufficiency because we haven't borrowed typically for special assessments? It's something we're going to have to take a look at. I think it's become exacerbated because starting in 2009, we really ramped up street projects. So we can't necessarily rely on the cash flow coming in to pay off our prior debts because our debts are coming in faster than we were collecting special assessments. So something we got to take a look at.
And Mark, you mentioned an audit of a full-blown audit of the special assessments funds. Now, special assessments were a specific comment in the audit. So haven't we already done that audit, or was that, just refresh my memory, was that because we had not billed the special assessments?
Their comment was based on the fact that we were behind in billing on special assessments. And maybe the audit isn't the right term, maybe it's a reconciliation, but we really do need to reconcile where we are with the borrowing, and we haven't done that in a few years, and it's probably due, just to make sure that we're not in a cash flow pinch. I think we're probably going to be improved with the fact that we've gotten some of these collections up to speed, but I think we would have had to look at this regardless because of us borrowing more in recent years than we were collecting in on the back end. And I can show you later on with one of the charts, show you where our debt capacity has been ramping up. And every time we started to accelerate capital improvements, you see our debt ratio going up. And I can show that in a little bit. The issue I want to talk about here is examples of when we have to pre-fund projects. In some cases, grants, reimbursement occurs upon the project completion. We may or may not have to borrow for that project, but we certainly have to front the money with the city until we can demonstrate that we've incurred those costs. The Main Street project is going to get, that's federal funding that we're getting for that. The Main Street project we're doing in a couple of years. The DOT, but it's funding that really comes, is that federal funding though? That's not LRIP, is it? Okay, it's essentially federal money that comes from the DOT. We'll front the money. The DOT will pay us back once we've documented the costs. And then probably the one that's the clearest example is tax revenue, tax increment financing projects. South Shore, Marion Road are probably classic examples. Tax increment revenues take years to realize, and in some cases we still haven't realized revenues on the South Shore because we're upside down in terms of the tax increment value for that district. What happens is we have to front the money. We can say tax increment is going to repay it, but until such time as we start getting tax increment flow, those are things that we have to fund up front. Those are just some examples of that. If we don't have levy money or cash money to put into those projects, we have to borrow for that. And essentially, that's what we've done with a lot of our tax increment districts. So that's our mechanism. Debt, if we don't have cash, that's our mechanism. And for the most part, it's general obligation debt. So I want to just refresh everybody's memory about the really four forms of debt that we utilize with the city. General obligation debt, I mentioned earlier, bonds are typically 20 years, notes are 10 years, and that includes funds borrowed from the state trust fund. Even when we borrow from the state trust fund, that's general obligation debt. Just because it's not done with a bond issue and Ellers doesn't come and talk about the bond sale, those simple ones that you've approved for, say, the hotel or for Oshkosh Corporation, we typically use the state trust fund because those are considered private purpose borrowings, and most of what we do when we do bonds are public purpose borrowings. We can't use that borrowing for that purpose. So we typically have used the state trust fund to fund those private type of improvements. When we did money for Oshkosh Corp, those and the hotel, we borrowed for those funds. Water utility debt, those are revenue bonds or notes, depending on how long we borrow for it. And then similarly, the sanitary sewer utility and the stormwater utility also use their utility debt.
And Mark, is the city's debt capacity is the cumulative total of those four forms of debt?
There is what's known as our general obligation debt, and there's also overlapping debt that not only includes this debt, but debt of all the other entities, including the school district. They want to make sure when Moody's is looking at this, they're not just looking at one level of debt. They're looking at it from the standpoint of what are your taxpayers on the hook for across the board. So when Moody's is looking at our debt, they're also looking at the debt that the school district incurred for Oak Lawn, because that's debt that our property owners are also paying. So they take a look at a lot more than even just this debt. It's a good question because Moody's looks at everything. And I think they're under the gun to look at all those issues nowadays. You may recall they look at things like how the economy is doing with Oshkosh Corp. Those are things that are of big concern to them, but overlapping debt, the county issuing debt, the school district issuing debt, even Fox Valley Tech, when they issue debt, even for an improvement up in Appleton, if it's debt for the entire district, it's not a lot because we're a very small portion of the overall district, but it's still district debt, and they allocate a portion of that when they analyze what's known as overlapping debt.
But statutorily, as far as the limit that the city's allowed to increase its debt to, is it just the general obligation debt, or is it
just general obligation debt?
Those other three forms don't factor into that?
No, but I will get into it's sort of a reverse of that question, because if we use general obligation debt for TIFs or utilities, it still counts against us. They know that it's not ultimately going to be an obligation of the general fund, but they want to make sure they still count it for purposes of their analysis. Right. And you'll see it when we get into one of the big charts later on. They look at both. So you'll see how they look at both of those. Okay. This kind of general fund or general obligation borrowing 101, if you've heard this before, which many of you have, I apologize, but I just felt it was appropriate to go through this. General obligation debt is the basic debt that we issue, backed by the full faith and credit of the city. What does that mean? That means that tax dollars are pledged to ensure repayment. That means if we need to pay off a debt, we pledge that we will increase the tax rate some sufficient to make that debt payment. That's what we commit to. It's the most reliable debt because it's the most secure debt. It's widely recognized. It's available. They know, based on the way the state law is written, that our state law allows you to increase the tax rate for debt. So they know that that's a very reliable debt revenue source. It's also, because it's so reliable, it's also the lowest interest rate of all municipal debt. I say tax exempt because taxable debt is a little different, but the fact that investors or buyers of the bonds can purchase these bonds and get the interest earnings are tax exempt from from federal purposes, people borrow it at a lower, people will buy a bond with a lower rate than they would, say, a corporate bond or any other type of taxable bond. The last thing I mentioned goes back to your question, Councilor Fitzgerald. It's a funding source for other debt, and I want to get into that a little bit because we've evolved over time on how we've done that, especially in recent years, but we have used it for other types of debt. I talked about it earlier, but here's other uses of general obligation debt. I've mentioned most of these already. Special assessments to address cash flow issues. We haven't done it recently, but it's something we need to do periodically to make sure we're okay. TIF projects, as I mentioned, that's probably certainly the biggest source of other uses of general obligation debt. It is an alternative to revenue debt if we've got good capacity and the rates are favorable. When we started our very aggressive street improvement program, and I'll say comprehensive street improvement program, and when we started aggressively going after stormwater projects and challenged Mr. Potek to build 2 ponds a year, and he's been pretty diligent about going after those ponds, even when we get delays and all the things we talked about last night. We've been very aggressive. As we did that, Ms. Stino and I took a look at our debt capacity, recognizing that we had capacity issues that we wanted to address. We started to shift some of our debt back towards revenue debt, because we knew that with street projects increasing and with stormwater projects increasing, we couldn't use GO debt for everything. We needed to shift that. What happens is the GO debt becomes a greater reliance on tax dollars to pay for it and less on revenue, and you'll see that as we get into some of the trends. Quite honestly, it's preferable to use GO debt. I would love to have all of our debt GO debt because it's less, it's a lesser rate, and it allows us to save money on interest. The reality is that because we were so aggressive with our capital improvement program, we needed to spread that out and put more utility debt in. Our debt over the last 5 years has increased dramatically. You can't just look at GO debt because of the shift towards revenue debt. Moody's takes a look at all that. They've been very favorable to us, even with some of the outlooks that they had with the stormwater utility. I think they still take a look at us very favorably, and I think Councilor Allison Osby pointed that out when she was going to one of her classes. We're still looked favorably, but every bit of debt has to be looked at because there's so many defaults going on right now. The bond market is looking very cautiously at every bit of municipal debt. We're better than most, but we could improve, and that's part of what we're talking about tonight. The other thing we use, we've talked about it, and I just want to mention it, capital outlay items with an economic life of greater than 10 years, we have been putting into borrowings. It's not something that I would necessarily subscribe to. I'd prefer to not borrow for those items. You could make some arguments that things like fire trucks, which have an economic life of 20 years, are appropriate for borrowings, and I wouldn't have much of an argument with that. I've done that plenty of times in the past in other places, but refuse trucks and recycling trucks. Refuse trucks are the ones, Dave, that have an economic life less than 10 years, correct?
Yes.
So we've been purchasing our garbage trucks because we know they take a pretty good beating. We know that they don't last 10 years. We also know that things like police cars don't last 10 years as well. So those are being paid for with cash in our operating budget as they should be. Meanwhile, recycling trucks, because they don't take as heavy a beating as garbage trucks do, they technically have an economic life greater than 10 years. Because of that, we've borrowed for those in the past. Even though they're essentially, it's the exact same vehicle used for similar but not the same purposes, we borrow for recycling trucks, we pay cash for refuse trucks. So you see the disparity that exists there, but we've been using it for plow trucks. We've been using it even for vehicles, and loaders, even service vehicles of large pickup trucks, things like that. We've borrowed for 10 years for those. It's not something that I'm necessarily proud of, but it's something that cities throughout the state have done as they've been pinched on their operating budgets. They've moved it over to capital. I know the Long Range Finance Committee's looked at that, and you recognize, I think, Councilor Alson Osby, Councilor/Chair Peck, and then Mayor Tower, before he became mayor, was also on the committee. You recognize it, and I think you've shared it with the rest of the council. That's a big issue that's out there. I don't have the solution for you tonight, but I can't ignore that issue that's out there. One of the things council did last year, and Peggy reminded me last week before she left, she said we did put money into the operating budget to pay for some capital items, which was close to $1 million. Thank goodness for that. Now, I'm hoping as we balance our budget that we don't have to cut that, because if we have to cut that, we go back to this practice, and I want to avoid this practice. So that's something that are a problem. So my summary there is when GO debt is used as shown above, it cuts into our debt capacity and may eventually compete for traditional capital projects. Traditional capital projects are streets, public building projects, and the refinancing of their long-term obligations. This goes back to the mayor's topic, our WRS, unfunded liability. That's what I'm referring to there. Those are long-term obligations that essentially compete when we use our GO debt for items up there. That becomes a problem. So those are the challenges that we have with GO debt. And again, our over-reliance on general obligation debt, the reason that our debt capacity has been going up is because we do have a very aggressive street stormwater program. With that said, if I had to do it again, I'd do it again. I think we've gotten a lot of positive public feedback because we've done what we've done. We certainly had to pay the price for it, but we've done the right thing in my estimation. Shift of utility debt to revenue bonds, that's allowed us to use more GO debt for that aggressive capital improvement program. High-profile TIF economic development projects that have a long payback. Oshkosh Corporation, the Best Western Hotel, and even the Aviation Business Park. The council approved the $640,000 to purchase the land, and then, depending on if and or when we get the grant from the EDA, we'll be putting in improvements. If we get the grant, we're going to be doing it sooner. If we don't get the grant, we're going to have to put the brakes on it and wait a while before we do it. But eventually, it's projects like that we've been very aggressive in pursuing for purposes of economic development. Those cut into our general obligation debt because the payback on those things takes a number of years. Matching funds for grants. The great news is we've gotten $2.5 million in grants for the Riverwalk. The bad news is we have to have a lot of matching funds to pay for those things. If we had to do it again, I would do it again. But recognize that every time we accept a grant, we accept all the obligations that go with it. And then, again, use of debt, 10-year notes to fund capital outlay. That's where our over-reliance on general obligation debt has occurred. This chart is really a reflection of this larger handout that you have, the largest number. This didn't look very pretty on the screen, so I had staff put it to a chart. But this gives you an idea of where we've gone with our limits. What I would draw to your attention is about a little past midway or about midway, just below the title that says status of municipal debt, it shows percent of limit. And that percent of limit is really that green line that you see, or the green bar. That's where we're at in terms of our overall debt. You can see the percentage there. The percentage had grown in years. It had gotten as high as 80%. A lot of that was due to a lot of TIF borrowing. Then I think the city and the council realized that we couldn't rely on that. I think in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a rebirth of we need to invest in our streets. That was right after Mr. Potek got here. We started to invest in streets. Then we took a break from that, and you can see it started to go down again, but the TIFs were still being used. The other column, 3 columns over, general fund percentage of debt, what that is complete general fund debt, not TIF debt, not utility debt. So we can say, well, that's really all that the general fund is ultimately responsible for. But the reality is until we get the cash flow to pay for those things, we really have to take a look we still have to take a look at the higher number. We can talk about it, but you can see what happened is the general fund debt, percentage of debt, that column, we were down into the 40s. Well, that's because most of our debt was TIF that was getting added on. But the reality is until the TIF turns around, we're still on the hook for those bills. So you really need to take a look at that middle column there, and that's what's reflected here. Now you can see as our property values increased throughout the 90s and throughout the early part of this century, you can see that our value went up. The red line is our indebtedness limit, which is a direct correlation with our property values. That's 5% of our equalized value. So as our property values went up, our debt capacity went up. But you can see we hit the brakes in 08. It actually has inched down a little bit here and there. So you can see that red line, our debt capacity, that's our limit. That's the most we can ever borrow, period, end of discussion. It hit the brakes. You can see that if you go down to the green and yellow line at the bottom here, total payment and debt added, you can see we added a lot of debt. We paid off a lot of debt, but we paid off a lot of utility debt, but we replaced it with general obligation debt. And that's why you see this percentage starting to inch up. It was down in the low 40s. Now it's back up to 55% after this year's borrowing will be done. So you see that it does take that turn, and that's what we got to keep an eye on, because we are becoming increasingly reliant on GO debt to fund GO operations, and we're slowly shedding utility debt, which sounds good, but the reality is we're taking on more debt for the general fund. I want to pause just to see if there's any questions, because there's a lot of information I'm throwing at you here, and I just want to make sure that you understand this chart. This is always in our CIP. I think Ed provided this when he was finance director. Peggy kept providing this. This has typically been in every document, and it actually is in it's in the adopted CIP after it's done. But we wanted to refresh your memories about where we are with debt capacity. The other one, just to give you an idea, this is the percent. This is that middle column that's just put in graphic form for you. You can see that we were up over 80%. Early part of the last decade. It went down in 08, but as we started to aggressively go after capital projects, it started to inch up, and I think we were trying to keep around 70%. We've inched up over 70%, and that's really the concern that's out there.
And that's really our debt limit in some ways, more realistically, is going to be in the 70 to 75%, right, before we get
Correct.
negative feedback. They're not real happy at the 70, but you get over 75%, and they get real unhappy.
When you start comparing us to our fellow AA2 rated communities, that's the barometer that they probably look at after property value. Property value, everybody's property value has been kind of static over the last few years. They do look at that. That would be great if our property value did go up, but it hasn't. So the next thing they look at is this ratio. How are we doing? If you take a look at some of the comments that come from Moody's when they've made their reports, they recognize it, but we're still in the ballpark with our comps. But if we start climbing up into the 80% range, the metrics aren't going to be in our favor.
As a ballpark,
But realistically, our limit is below what that limit is on the page.
yeah, that's the absolute. There's a reason it's a red line. What would be considered ideal? And there's the financial reality, which is that 70 to 75% that you were kind of mentioning. What would be ideal if all things were perfect? What would be our? I know that's an awful big assumption, but
Want me to handle that one? Because Peggy's covered it in long-range finance.
If Peggy's covered it, I think that's probably a good way to.
Gold standard would be about 50%.
okay.
If you're at 60%, you're doing really well.
Now, there are some communities that have property values to die for.
Waukesha, for example, their property, their assessed value is unbelievable, being, a collar county, collar of Milwaukee. So if you would look at, their debt level, it's below that. But the rating agencies would say 50% would be the gold standard.
Thank you.
60 would be,
Still doing real
really good.
If we wanted to go to AA1, we would likely need to get it down to 60. Again, there's our debt limit. And then this is actually in your packet. I took out the notes, but I would refer to the notes. What I did here was, this is something that Peggy has provided you in previous years, and for tonight's purpose, I put together a couple models, and it really goes back to the far right column that you see, percentage of debt limit used. You can see that as of 2013, based on what we're projected to borrow within the next 6 weeks, we're going to be close to 75% of debt capacity. So as we look forward to 2014 with this capital improvement plan, where do you want to land? Where do you want our percentage to be versus how much you want to borrow? So what I did was I created several scenarios, and so I'll go to the paper itself because it has the notes here, and you'll see footnote 1 gives you an idea of what we're planning to borrow for 2013. We will be bringing this to council in the coming weeks. In fact, Ehlers and Associates wants to give us as much flexibility as possible. We'll be coming to you in the next at the next meeting with authorization to start the borrowing process, so that Ehlers can time a sale, not necessarily on a Tuesday, a council Tuesday, but time it so that we can take advantage of borrowing on any given day, and then the council will give parameters that what they would allow borrowing to take place, and then once they feel that they can get those parameters in the open market, they'll put it on the market, and we'll report back to council with that. It's known as a parameters resolution. But what we're looking at borrowing, and we also have to count what we've already committed for this year. The assumptions were the $2 million, the upfront TIF for the Best Western Hotel, the $640,000 from the Aviation Industrial Park property. Both of those were borrowed through the State Trust Fund because those were private purposes. Estimated amount for the Public Works Field Operations Facility, $5,760,000, and then the remainder is other CIPs, a little over $7.5 million. So that takes the borrowing for 2013 to $15.9 million. Now, if you go back up to 2013, and I can, you can see it pointed out here with this line for 2013, we're retiring $12.5 million in debt for 2013, but we're taking on $15.9 million. That's why our ratio goes from 73 to 75%. So that's what we're facing with this year's borrowing. So as we look forward to next year, I'm kind of putting the council in the same position that we did with the operating budget. Give you an idea of what we're looking at for 2014. And what I've done is given you 4 different scenarios. Footnote number 2 refers to what I think probably the most likely scenario, but it depends on what your comfort level is. What it assumes is that the debt ratio is going to remain exactly at 75.09%. What that would assume is a borrowing of $12,644,000. We're paying off $12,635,000, so there's a very slight increase, very slight, less than $10,000 of borrowing. Assuming that we have no change in our equalized value, which these days I think you can't make an assumption that we're going to have any growth in our equalized value. So we've made all these scenarios, we've frozen our equalized value projection. So that means our debt limit stays the same. So at $12,644,000, we'd stay at 75.09%. So we hold serve from 2013 to 2014. The assumptions are shown in footnote 2. Assumes maintaining debt limit, same as 2013. The borrowing would be as follows. about $400,000 for major equipment, not including general fund cash contributions, other property improvements of about $800,000, $6 million for the Public Works Operations Facility, $2.4 million for the Aviation Industrial Park match. I'm being the eternal optimist, assuming we're getting the grant, but I put that assumption in there. And then lastly, that only leaves $3 million for other CIPs. That includes streets, that includes Riverwalk, that includes TIFs. Any and all borrowing. You just can't say, oh, it's for Dave's street projects. It wouldn't be just for Dave's street projects. Everything in the CIP would be competing for that remaining $3 million. Now, if we didn't say we don't get the grant, if we don't get the grant, we're not doing the Aviation Industrial Park in 2013. At most, 2014. We might do a little design work. But $12.6 million. The other scenarios that I've proposed are footnote 3 simply assumes that we borrow the same amount that we borrowed in 2013. When you see what happens, it takes our debt ratio up to nearly 77%. I'm not pointing that out to recommend it. I'm pointing out that's what happens if you borrow exactly what we're borrowing this year. That clearly is taking us in the wrong direction. But I point it out because that's a scenario. Another scenario is, we want to get ourselves back to where we were in 2012. Kind of back up a little bit, get ourselves to 73%. That would require us only to borrow $8.7 million. Well, that's not going to get us very far, because to get us down to $8.7 million means we don't do the Aviation Industrial Park and we do no street improvements. Probably not a likely scenario either. Recognizing that $6 million we've effectively committed ourselves to with the central garage. At a minimum, we're borrowing $6 million, which means that scenario number 5 of only borrowing $4.9 million to get us back to our 2011 level of 71% is just not feasible, but it would have to be so drastic that we would just simply cancel the central garage project. Not a likely scenario, since we've already signed our contract. So it just gives you a feel for what we would need to do to, pull the Band-Aid off right away and get ourselves back down. I wanted to point these scenarios out so that you have an idea. The other thing I did is...
Ask another question here.
Oh, please, I'm sorry.
As we go beyond, how much the central garage project obviously has loomed big in this whole discussion. Substituting streets for the central garage, we need the central garage. After 2014, what do we still have left on the central garage? When are we going to get that burden off our back?
The last borrowing that would be necessary in 2015 would be a little under $3.4 million. So it'll go from 6 down to 3.4. So that'll free up.
About 50% decrease.
Yeah, I mean, that when we had you award the bid, that was the number. So I brought the notes that we made from the meeting that when we presented that to council. So that frees up either debt capacity for more projects or for less borrowing. And that's looking forward to 2015. So I think that answers your question, Mr. Mayor.
Does this borrowing also does this also cover utility and revenue borrowing, or is this just general obligation debt?
General obligation debt only.
So we would still be borrowing, we would still be able, the continuance of the stormwater management program is not part of this calculation.
No, it's
So the
not.
citizens understand that, by not seeing stormwater here, we're not saying we're not doing stormwater projects, it's just that it's out of a different funding source, even though it's still out of my left pocket as opposed to my right pocket, but it's still out of our bank account.
It is impacted because when you
Do streets,
street projects,
street projects are some of both.
reduce storm sewer with the streets, but it wouldn't impact the detention basins.
Most of our focus for 2014 and to another degree 2015, most of our stormwater investment is going to be in the ponds and the non-street projects, just because they're not hand in hand with the street improvement. So the different ponds, getting the armory done, getting hopefully 9th Street done. What are some of the other ones, Dave?
We had a big relief storm sewer in the airport in 2014.
Okay, so a lot of the work that we've been doing over there on 23rd, getting everybody angry. The whole idea is we didn't want to get the relief sewer going until we got that one done. So those are the types of things that are dedicated to stormwater only that we'll focus on in 14. And to a lesser degree, we'll be doing similar things in 2015. Libby Nicolay, projects like that. That's a 2015 project, isn't it, Dave? Libby Nicolay? Or do we push that in?
That's 16, I believe.
16.
But 15 at 9.
Okay, excuse me, 9. So,
And the other thing is, as we go forward, we're not getting much relief from our debt retirement. Actually, it's going down.
and that's the other
It's not
part.
helping us out much.
That's the other part that, as we're looking ahead, you can see at the bottom left of this slide, the debt retirement is actually going down a little bit. We're not going to be retiring as much debt. So your debt capacity is a function of how much you're paying off and how much you're taking on, and that's where I was really focusing on that as the number, and pending what kind of feedback I get from this presentation tonight, I'm really looking for some direction on where you're thinking of going. These are 4 scenarios. I'm not saying these are the only 4, because they're not, but we got to recognize what our obligations are. And with the central garage clearly is the big one here. That puts us on the hook for $6 million right off the top. And then there are other projects that are going to be necessary as well. And I can get into some of those things. I'll wait a little while, but that's really what the kind of where I want to frame tonight's discussion is, where do we want to go here? Because and where do we want to go here with percentages, which dictates where we go here with how much debt we want to take on.
I would think that we don't want to make a bad situation worse. I would think that, looking at 2014, my direction would be trying to maintain at that 2013 level.
I wasn't looking for the answer immediately, but I appreciate it. There's more stuff to show the impact, but that's why that's what I'm recommending, and that's kind of why. But Deb's been waving.
Well, no, I think the biggest thing that I understand it, and I know we probably do, but we don't vocalize it, and we didn't really vocalize it last year, is, we borrow this money, but we have to make the interest payments to those bond holders. And I think what would be helpful for the public to know, as well as the council, is what are we paying annually in interest payments back to the bondholders, because that's important, because that then affects, if there's any hiccups throughout the year and cash flow tightens, the worst thing that could ever happen is that we would have a major hiccup somewhere in the regular budget and ever miss a bond payment. So even though this looks like one situation here, it does tie into the overall budget. So I think that's something, if staff could provide, so that people understand in terms of numbers, when we're borrowing this kind of money, what are we paying out? Because it's easy to look at what do we get and what are we doing and how much are we in debt, but when it comes time to pay the bill twice a year, that's pretty substantial.
I didn't bring the operating budget. It's a great question, deserves a great answer, but one of the things that we do to illustrate that point is the pie chart that we use to say where your tax dollars go, or where your general fund expenditures are. Our general fund expenditures right now are about 25%, or principal and interest. Doesn't answer your question completely, but 25% is principal and interest. That's a sizable amount of money. Now, you take a look at $12 million. Well, no, I shouldn't use that as the, but, no. That's
On our sheet here, would that be the fourth and fifth column, interest paid and principal paid?
You may have already answered the question.
Because we have the column, so you have interest paid, so you're looking at, in 2012, we paid $5,100,000 $17,578 in interest.
Yeah.
Roughly 17.
Yeah, that's probably the number. So that gives you, and that makes sense, because when I said 25%, our budget's about 65 million, so 65, 66, so a quarter of that would be 17 million. 12 million in principal plus 5 in interest, you're at 17. So the answer to your question is 5 million. Thank you.
And that's what I'm saying is, I don't think we've ever really articulated that to the public so that they understand, this is not a small ticket item when we're paying, when we're borrowing this money, whether it's, we talk about we're in a low interest environment, and we are. However, $5 million is $5 million.
Yeah, and that's coming out of our operating budget. So that's $5
coming out of
million
the operating budget, correct.
for police, fire,
Right.
snow plowing, the whole 9 yards.
Right.
And the advantage of the community, that goes back to Tom's question, what's the ideal? Or somebody said, well, what's ideal? And Tom said, 50% would be ideal. If we were at 50%, what would our interest payment be? Our interest payment would be a heck of a lot less, which every dollar you free up for debt, you could, in theory, there's a lot of complicating, in theory, that could go towards operations. So the less you rely on debt, it's no different than home. If you don't have a big car payment, you can pay more for groceries because you're not making a big interest payment. And we're a big household.
And understanding what the interest payment is, but our constituents also demand that we provide these capital improvements, that we improve the streets, that we, some would argue, did we need a new central garage? And anyone who would ever been in there, would understand that we do. So, that has to also be explained and understood as well. That if you want better streets, there's a cost of that better street. So
that's kind of where we're at. I do have a few more slides to finish, if we could, because it kind of gets to some of the points that are getting around here to where we want to go. This kind of gives you a projection model. This is a summary of it. What I will draw your attention to is page 48. This slide is a small excerpt of page 48. It goes to some of the questions, and there have been so many questions I forgot who asked it, so I'm not trying to not give credit where credit's due. This is a sources and uses statement for what's been requested. This isn't what's being proposed, it's been requested. We have to get back to what we're ultimately going to be submitting to council for formal, but this is where we're at today. Requests were $52,352,000 for capital improvements. Seems very daunting. But what we did was we broke it down by sources, where the money's coming from. You can see that the columns across, down the first column are all the categories that we talked about with my very first slide. Those are the categories of capital improvements. But then here are the sources. General obligation bonds, and I throw TIF in there as well. You can't ignore TIF, even though it doesn't show up in the total. General obligation notes. You see that most of the notes are in public property and equipment. Then there's water bonds, sewer bonds, storm bonds. So it goes to the question that came up, are we doing storm improvements? Yeah, we've got storm bonds that we're projecting for next year of $8.2 million. Some of it's in streets, but you see that number is a lot lower than it's been in previous years, $2.3 million. We're still doing some streets, just not as many. The bulk of our work in 2014 for stormwater are stormwater projects, the relief sewer, the
Armory.
Armory, yeah. So you can see that we're relying more for big stormwater projects rather than some of the streets. But you can see special assessments. That's an issue. It's not as much. It's slightly less than $3 million, but you can see that we rely on it. A lot of it's utilities, but it's also a good portion of its streets. Then grants and then other funding sources that are actually, the last few columns are all cash, but obviously the cash are the smallest amounts of money that we're throwing money directly into. But you can see the sources and uses. What I did with this slide is I boiled down to general fund, general obligation, because I wanted to give you a flavor for what we have. So I took all the different categories, and anything that didn't involve general fund borrowing, I took out of this sheet. And I did provide this summary sheet to you as well with one of your other handouts, just to simplify it. I titled it Summary of 2014 CIP Request and Impact on GO Borrowing. That's this one. It's a little smaller. That's what this slide is. But you can see that general obligation bonds are $8 million. If you just, to humor me, forget about the TIF projects for now and just took a look at notes, magically, the subtotal for GO bonds and notes is $12,615,000. That is entirely coincidental that the number I put in there for borrowing, $12,644,000, magically we have enough. However, that's not correct because some of this borrowing, and I don't have the answer for you completely because I do miss Peggy, and Ed's only been here 2 days. I haven't been able to break down how much of this TIF contribution is from funds we have on hand versus what we'd have to borrow for. But if I assumed, and I think for purposes of this discussion, I just made a blanket assumption that every nickel of TIF contribution has to be borrowed for. And if you make that assumption, then we're $8.6 million short of what's been requested. So that means we either have to find some of the TIF money that comes in cash, or we got to cut projects. So that's kind of the gap that we're looking at. It could be as high as $8.6 million. That seems daunting, but we just have to make some. We have to make some decisions on what we're going to cut. TIF is probably where we would look to first, but after TIF, we have to take a look at these other categories. Street improvements. We're obligated of $6 million of the public property improvements because of the central garage. We're not under an obligation for park improvements. There are things on the note side, public property improvements, non-utility, I would still like to do. But I can't do everything I'd like to do. I can only do things that we can afford. This gives you an idea of the challenges we have ahead of you. When we talked about the operating budget, it was $2.5 to $3 million. With this, it's $8 million. It seems daunting, but these are not layoffs, cuts to services. These are projects that we defer. A lot of them are in the TIF area, so that's probably where we would look to. We've got an hour left in our workshop. We can get into some of the guts to take a look at some of the projects if you like. That's not the purpose of tonight, but it'll give you a flavor of what would need to get done to get us down. My gut feeling is that Tom already gave an indication. That seems about right. 12.6 million hold serve on where we're at. That may not be everybody's thought, but if it was, we still had to figure out where we're going to get a funding gap of about $8.6 million. With that cheery presentation, and you've asked a lot of questions along the way. Now I turn it over to council for any questions, comments, or direction that they would like to give us.
Mark, where was it that, like, that there was the actual TIF projects we're looking at for this year?
TIF projects, I think the best place to go would be, I would really go back into the document.
44.
Page 44.
Yeah, I'd go straight to page 44. You can see the summary on page 46. You can see that the city contribution, meaning borrowing, is $8.6 million on an $11.8 million borrowing.
Were any of these things that we were thinking, we're going to come to fruition based on the progress of the economic development direction?
None whatsoever.
None whatsoever, okay.
I want to make sure that was clear, because
Okay.
that's a complicated issue. The biggest one is the airport business park. If we get the grant, we're kind of under the gun. And it goes back to whenever we're blessed with grants, we're also blessed with the obligations that flow from that.
What would the grant be, excuse me, Mark, on that?
Page 44, top of page 44, federal grant, $2 million.
Okay. All right, okay, all right. So then that's the net of the,
That's the net. So that would be, and as I showed on the slide with the footnote number 2, that would assume we would borrow for that.
And realistically, that's tending to look positive at this point as opposed to negative or neutral. It's on
Yeah,
on the tick side of positive. So it's not
you get
not something that just might happen. It's something where there's a probability that it will. So that obligation may well be there. A high probability of being there.
And I know we're not going over project to project tonight, but in just kind of looking at some of the projects, and maybe Mr. Potek can correct me if I'm wrong, some of these seem to be awful small. And this is not a knock to the citizens, obviously, that have bad streets or need this, but some of these are awful small streets in the city. Could they be, are they part of an overall bigger picture? You know, we talked a lot of times that you really got to turn the street upside down and look at the ages of the infrastructure and those types of things. Or would we be better off on some of these that some are actually newer streets coming into the city through annexation? They take some of the smaller street projects and only do a couple of the bigger streets that are more impacted by more traffic, more direct to our locations as event city. Because, you know, I hear from citizens that, you know, some of the streets getting to the convention center, some of the streets getting to the Leach Amphitheater, some of these streets getting to the downtown area are in worse shape than some of our neighborhood streets, and yet, and again, it's not a knock to any of the citizens that live like on Ida or Ripon Lane or, you know, would we, where we are in a tight year, maybe look at saying, for example, Edgewood Village subdivision. I mean, are those things that we absolutely have to do? Could they be deferred out a year or 2 or 3 and just do a couple of more major streets like we already have in there, such as, Parkway is obviously a major street. Central is somewhat of a major street going to and from Church down to Irving, which is an important area of the central city. But then you look at some of the other ones, I know that one of the reasons Cope Ave is on there is because there was some talk of an agreement when they were going to build some homes in there, annexation, I think there was. Burnwood Drive, that's a new annexation. Do we need to go in there right away within the first year of annexation? Just a thought, in that Butler and Pickens Avenue. Not that again, those streets are important. They're part of the city. They're important to, Winnebago mental health. But at the same time, they're on the very fringes of our city. Stearns Drive, that's a newer addition too, and that's pretty far out also. Just wondering if there's ways we could look at some of these projects and say, maybe it's more important that, we look at some of the other streets that are pushed back out and that are more thoroughfares than some of the, because, we just got that petition, for those subdivisions out on Keenville, and that they don't feel that at this point that's needed. That we, as we move these projects forward too, and I know we do public hearings and things like that, but when people are 4 or 5 years out from a project, are they even notified that their street is up for improvements 3 or 4 years from now, so that they can start planning, or do we only give them a year out before they're notified that their street's even under consideration of construction?
Well, a follow-up to your thing about Coop Avenue, that's a development, it's going to be rental, and it says it's paid for by assessment. Who is assessed the, $839,000? The developer?
Would be developers and abutting property owners.
So it's a little of both. In that case, it'd be the developer as well as those adjoining property owners. One side of the street's a development, the other side of the street is...
It was an initial development which required the other side of the street to also be developed. So that's why it's 100% assessed. So that's what you really have to look at when you look at some of these categories is what is the funding source? Because Mark's talking about general
Right.
obligation versus assessments. And so, and actually, some of the questions you were asking when you saw the projects, like on page 11, where you asked about Butler and Stearns, those are actually listed as projects funded this year. They didn't get done, so they're already in the budget. It's just showing that it didn't get done this year based on complications with the parties we're dealing with not getting their part done, so we couldn't move ahead, and so that it has to be pushed back, versus the Burnwood Drive project is a project that's being shown as a new, it is an annexed area, but it's an area that has people that need sanitary sewer lateral. After they had a meeting with the city manager and I, they were concerned that rather than having each one of them individually deal with contractors, they wanted it to be a large project to minimize their cost.
Okay.
So we have, if you start right at the front and look at the projects, Mr. Godey has laid out a plan, and it's really, while some of the projects like Bismarck might be related to a petition, which then pushes it to the top of the list. Many of them are related to utilities. So the first one, it's a big project on Bowen Street. We have a very bad sanitary sewer. It got pushed to the top of the list, even though if you drive down this section of Bowen between New York and Nevada, you'd say the pavement's not that bad.
Right.
Well, the sanitary sewer is horrible, and so that's our problem. The street is 40-plus years old, but it needs utility work. And so that's what we look at when we organize these. So Foster is an area similar to Bismarck. It's areas where people have requested, and so they've moved up over time to the top of the list, and that's how they get included, versus a project like Central. When you go through a neighborhood like Central, you can't just do Central. We end up doing Parkway and we end up doing Ida. But you have to remember the reason Central is in is because we just did a detention basin, and now we have to get the storm sewer to the City Hall detention basin. So that's why this is a priority.
Okay.
So if it's related to age, it might be one thing relating to stormwater flooding. It might be another thing relating to areas that have annexed in that don't have utilities. That's what Ripon Lane is. It's a new area. It also has flooding problems, but it has no utilities. And so that's what happens with prioritization. We're looking at
And not to add further work onto your staff or you yourself, I guess that information would be good to have up front. Even those streets that people have petitioned, it would be nice for council just to kind of know where that's at, so that we have an idea of why they got, like you said, put to the top of the list. And, because a lot of these, pace rating of 6, like you just said, but, yeah, we have a bad sanitary sewer there. Some of these other ones you mentioned, they need to be tied into some other projects that we already did. And I guess that's the little extra information I suppose we could call you and ask for, but we've updated.
Kyle is on the Stormwater Utility Committee, so these are I think every year, James Robbie and Steve Godey go to the Stormwater Utility Committee and explain how the projects are getting prioritized.
Okay.
Without getting caught up in the details of the project,
Right.
the points that you're raising that were very valid, and and they all have a story to tell. And I think you can let's just use Bowen Street as a good example, because it's a pretty comprehensive street. The one for Central, there's so many other projects that go along with it, like Ida and everything. There's a lot of moving parts. But Bowen, for 2014, is pretty straightforward. But for purposes of our discussion with general obligation bonds, you can see that we're proposing, the slide I brought back here, we've got $1.3 million that is being requested in general obligation borrowing for comprehensive street improvements and utility. And then go back to page 2. And you can see that $393,000 of it is for street improvements that the city's going to fund. The balance of that are all the utilities. Why? Because both, and you can see wastewater is the biggest part, because that's a pretty good size. It's not an interceptor, but it's a.
No, it is an interceptor.
It is an, okay, excuse me, it is an interceptor, so that's a huge portion. That's why we're doing Bowen. But it only costs us $393,000, so that's not a lot of money for street work. But we're borrowing a heck of a lot of money on the sanitary sewer side of it. So you can get an idea, out of almost $4.4 million for the entire project, almost $3.2 million of it is borrowing just from the sanitary utility, and only $400,000 is going to be borrowed for street improvements. So those are the types of things you want to take a look at. When you go to Central, you see that most of it's stormwater.
And if I could just expand here, you could see on the map, there's more dots that show the interceptors going actually all the way to Murdoch. And if you look on page 18, you'll see a project where it talks about decommissioning a pump station. So we have these master plans on dealing with our sanitary sewer system, and in this regard, by extending a main, we're able to get rid of a pump station. And it's something we looked at so that we can get rid of those annual operating costs of running a pump station if the flow can just run by gravity. So that's what happens with this sort of program. It gets set up with many components that, the stormwater, the sanitary sewer, the water mains all tie into. We can just say, oh, you're just fixing a street. Well, you're not just fixing a street.
I think all of these have a story to them and a priority to them. I mean, you can take any one of these, as like we did with the parks last year, but I think at some point we're going to have to come up, like we did with the Parks Department last year. They had like 12 projects. It was this much in kind of rank order, because you people know all of the stories. It's hard for us to evaluate all of the stories. And there's some of these we have to accept on faith down to a point, and these are the ones that if something has to go, or not necessarily go, because we may be pushing things back. In other words, like when it comes to the TIFs, South Shore redevelopment could conceivably be pushed back, just like we did. You want to move faster, but you can't. But the other thing is having that so we don't have to evaluate all the stories, but the stories on those that might go out or get pushed back. We're going to need, I think, some leadership there, because we can't take each one of these, hear the story that this is why it's needed, because all of them have a story. All of them have a story. But if we're going to get down to where we want to be in aggregate, I mean, that's something we have to do. And then tell us what we're giving up by doing it that way.
Ultimately, for the sake of discussion, if the council said, that's the number we want you to go with, Mark, that $12.6 million that they had in the footnote. If that's the number, for example, we wanted to go with, then we got to come back, and that's the number. And that's the number we'll come back with. That means we're going to have to cut all those projects that you mentioned, Steve. We're going to have to go through each one of them and say, we have a couple projects in there, for example, on those outer fringes of areas we just annexed. Do we have to do them? We've traditionally have done them upon annexation. Do we have to? Not necessarily. But we have to take a look. Are those ones going to end up on the cutting room floor if we got to do street improvements? That's possible.
I think for the council, we kind of decide on an overall number that we'd like to know what has to be cut and why that has to be cut, so we know what's being cut, and so we can explain it, or we have to make a decision that we want to change our number.
Because when you put these in this booklet, Dave, these aren't in the order priority, right? Like Bowen is number one, got to get done. Foster Street's got to get done, that's why it's number 2 listed. Maybe in the future, that might be the easier way the mayor's saying is, put them in the order of importance that these need to be done because of these reasons. One street adds to another street, adds to another street for sanitary sewer or storm sewer. So that, again, as we get into and put that number out there, we know that 9 and 10 could go farther out.
Sure. As painful as it was, the Parks Department provided that, the Parks Board gave excellent direction. It was unfortunate you had to make those decisions, but they helped you do that. You're going to get another document eventually based on what we talk about tonight. That document's going to be significantly different. the projects that end up on the cutting room floor will get pushed back to 15 and 16 and 17 and 18, and then next year, you'll see it pushed back to 19 as well.
And as you said, Dave, and that's very important, when the citizens request something and they're willing to pay their fair share, that's something I think council needs to know, so that we can respond to our citizens and say, yes, they're the ones that wanted it. Just like when we get the petitions for the other things, that they don't want the streetlight taken out or stop and go light taken out or whatever it is, you know. So I do think it's important to have a little bit of, this one's number one, this is number two, and, you know, kind of rate them in a sense. And I know that adds to the work for your staff and Mr. Robbie and Mr. Godey, and they do an excellent job. I mean, having the maps and everything really helps.
I'm struck by the similarities of the conversations that we're having here to the conversations that we've had as a stormwater utility, particularly with the ripple effect, with if we bump this project from 13 to 14, from 14 to 15, how that affects the whole chain of events. And even if we just stick to the text of this document, looking at Bowen Street as a whole, if we bump part of Bowen Street, well, there's another part of Bowen set for 15, so that gets pushed back. And so these ripple effects that affect multiple systems, because as we were talking about earlier, it's not just the street, but everything underneath it. So if we change something on the stormwater side, or if we change something on the street side, it affects the ability of other projects to go on. And I know Mr. Godey has a wonderful multicolored map that has all of these overlapping streets, sanitary sewer, wastewater, and stormwater system rated. Like, we see the PACER rating in our packet here. That's the street over the top. The number here for a sanitary sewer just tells us when it was installed. But that map that he has in that planning shows, okay, this is a failing stormwater system, or there's no stormwater there at all. And so that, I'm struck by the similarity in the, we have to prioritize at this level as in the boards.
What I'm asking is that priority come to us by the people who know and understand that,
Absolutely.
so that we don't, so they don't give us all the information on each one, and then we keep asking.
Right.
Then we sit down and argue the micro part of it. Well, let's substitute 2 for 3, because I think petitions are more important than moving something back. I'm willing to let the city at least do some of that, and then know what's getting taken off and what the consequences of that are. I don't want us going through all that prioritizing. Once we prioritize what's important in terms of debt.
And I guess my statement is, this is something that's happening in our boards and commissions, and that feedback goes directly back to the city staff. And so that information does get to us, but it may not be in this room at this instant. But how those boards and commissions are asking those questions about why are we spending this money on this year is being asked, and I think that's the important part. Is it's happening at all levels, and it's just a matter of making sure that we can get that information here, so that we can make the best decision possible.
I was just wondering, did we ever get the original question that someone asked, which was, how much notice do we actually give people? You know, do we give them a 4 or 5 year, or is it a 1 year, or?
1 year.
We pretty much do it in the fall of the year. These are the streets that we're planning to do next year. Some of it's a function of, because there's so many moving parts, that a project may get pushed back for other reasons that we don't know at the time, because these projects don't get designed until really the year before they get done, or sometimes the winter before they get done.
Right now, the streets on this list, which the list was actually already reduced based on our discussion with Mark on how to fund the central garage. So we had other streets on the 2014 list that had to be moved back to 15 already. But anyways, the intent is that we typically had what was called a neighborhood meeting with the Community Development Department, because they talked about their grant program at the same time that we would be talking about the capital improvement program. And so the capital improvement program went to the Plan Commission in October, and then the neighborhood meeting was at the end of October or something like that, and then the capital improvement program came to the council in November. And so then that's like an initial meeting for the paving projects. Then they have more meetings in the spring when we have our public hearings And
Unfortunately, we typically don't get a good turnout until we start telling people how much it's going to cost us. Then, as you saw the previous council meeting, then they come out and you get a lot of great input at that point. But Dave's turnouts for those ones in the fall are pretty good. The reason community development worked with them was because they'd get nobody to come to their CDBG meeting, and this was a way to get people to come to the CDBG meeting. Dave's staff would send out a notice, your project's on the list for next year, but we don't give them, here's your estimated special assessment, and invariably, the first question out of anybody's mouth is, well, what's this going to cost me? And we say, well, we're still working on that. And they were like, well, why'd you invite us? All we want to know is how much it's going to cost us, and because we're still in the design process at that point.
well, we're able to give them general information based on the current year. So we get many questions. So, for instance, for this year, we would anticipate many questions for 14 based on what we did in 13. But if we would invite people 5 years from now, and we would say, we don't know whether your program's going to get pushed back, I think Mark is exactly right. People want to know when it's the year they have to pay. So that's why we invite the 1 year.
Well, I guess the point is, because how I keep looking at this is, we have cash going out, we have to have cash coming in. So we finish the project, and then within how long then do we plan to bill them? Because technically what we're saying is that they have 15 years to pay. So what I'm trying to figure out is there any way, whether it's a guess and understanding that projects can get put behind, if they're given an additional year or an additional 2 years notice, would it then be appropriate to go from a 15-year payback plan to, say, a 12-year or, 10-year? I'm just trying to figure out, and then based on when the project gets done, how soon are we billing them so that we have that opportunity for the payment to come back in? Because really, it's all about, I hate to say it, but it's all about money. And a lot of this should be dealing with cash flow in, cash flow out. Otherwise, we're setting ourselves up for possibly a real cash.
Well, we don't have a policy, right, currently, of how soon after a street project's done,
No,
the homeowner gets billed?
We don't. It's a good point. We're more caught up than we've ever been in the last 5 years. The state project's probably one's holding us up the most, getting the final numbers from them. Dave and I have had a conversation. He knows I want those out. Generally, the current year projects typically don't get billed out in time for them to be put on this year's tax roll. The projects are just getting finished up. Finance really needs these by October 1, and they're just finishing up, say, Oregon and stuff like that.
They actually, if there's a perfect example, we're still going to be paving 23rd, Montana, Doty. We won't be done by October 1st.
When we do a total street, for example, just take Bone Street, what is the warranty on the work? Is it 2 years?
Our contract requires a 2-year warranty.
So wouldn't that kind of be the guideline, that within 2 years, the homeowner will get billed, because it's like a warranty thing, almost like that if there is a problem with the street after it was poured, it's going to get fixed, that type of thing?
What the city manager has requested, and what we did this year, was to get caught up. So anything that was done in 12 was billed in 13.
Okay.
So we're about a year behind. And that is really the answer to your question. What should the standard be? We should have it billed the year following. That's the minimum expectation.
Yeah, and to be honest, Mr. Patek, I'm over here. Just kidding. Because you're involved in it day to day. One of the questions that I had is, I don't know what's actually involved in the process, but is that something where we go back to the operating budget, and is it a matter of putting, creating a position so that we're actually able to get the bill out at the end of the year that the project is actually done? But I don't know what's involved in that process, so I don't know if that's realistic or not.
It really goes to the requirement for when the earliest we need to get it in this year's tax bill. we need to have that number ready by October 1.
Well, but that's what I'm saying is I don't, why?
Typically, well, because the process, in order to get it on a tax bill, there's certain reporting requirements. It takes time for the city clerk to get out a notice to say, the city clerk, Dave's staff turns it over to Pam, and Pam then sends out the bill saying, here's your bill, and here are your options, and you have an option to pay it, and so we give them about 30 days. And Ed, is there enough memory that you can remember what the process is? But it's pretty much, they got to have it by November. We need an answer by November 1st.
Yeah, we get into the tax roll transfer, so there's all timing issues in there.
Okay.
That's why Pam has her basically October 1st deadline, so she can do her step, and then she has to put in whatever the responses are, and then you can put stuff on the tax roll for the next.
So it goes back to the.
Pavement programs, there's a 10-year
Right.
and a 50.
Right.
I would have to have Pam.
Right,
what people
but,
think.
so it kind of goes back to this 2-year, we kind of have a 2-year window from completion of project to when the bill needs to get out. I guess we should, and maybe we need a policy, I don't know. But that would make it easier for staff to say, man, here's the policy, council said, we have to have it done in 2 years or 3, whatever we would agree
I
to.
think we're working under the new policy that the city manager wants it done in 1 year.
Edict from the city managers, get it done, because it's no different. I mean, I've had discussions with Burke about businesses that have done well and failed in the community. You hear those things. Billing your customers is a huge part of business failure. If you don't get your bills out, you're not going to get cash flow in. And so it is a very fundamental thing, and we need to get these bills out in a very prompt manner. And it's not the only problem. There's other challenges we have.
Well,
but for the special assessment fund, we do need prompt billing.
And I don't know if this is the time to ask this question, but how do we go about for those homes that are in foreclosure and all that we do streets on? How do we get money out of those people? Or the bank or whoever? I mean, do we have to go after them? I mean, do we have to legally go after them through?
On the taxes.
We put it on the tax roll.
So it just sits there, though, I mean, in a sense, right?
Well, you can ask our friends at the county, because our friends at the county are the ones who really end up holding the bag on these
Okay,
things.
so the county pays
We got our
us.
money, we got our money up
We
front,
get paid first
but they make 12%.
for now. Yeah.
But to add to your comment about, getting the billing out quickly, what's more important is getting the money in quickly, too.
Right.
Correct. Because you get the bills out, you get the money in.
Right.
Yeah. And I think we've improved on that. Dave's aware of it, and I think we're doing better on that. It still goes back to what our cash outlay are for these projects, because whether we bill promptly or not, that's a management practice that should be done. And I think based on what the auditors said and what you heard in the response you've given me, that expectation's there and it should be done.
I guess it's just as a policy board, and that's really what we are, is if you don't feel you need a policy, then we'll, but I do
It
think.
wouldn't bother me. Policy wouldn't bother me. It would just help me reinforce it with staff. That's certainly, I don't have any concern with that type of policy. I think it should be an expectation that you should get even without a policy. But if you adopted a policy, I would be in full support of it.
I guess one thing I would say, though, is we always have, it's interesting, the discussion we have about interest rates, because on the one hand, people complain about the interest rates, but if we're really concerned about getting people to pay up, if we had a higher interest rate, people would pay up quicker. So sometimes you're balancing things because people seem to be yelling at you from all sides.
Yeah, well, they don't like the 6% now. If we went up to 8, they'd really be yelling at us.
Well, last year when we had the workshop on special assessments, we were trying to find relief. In effect, our relief to people who can't afford the special assessments is we've gone to 15 years. Most communities only go 10. The ones that have gone 15 have done it in recognition that we're trying to take care of hardship situations. And that's been our answer to that. But Councilor Allen Osby's point is that if it takes us 2 years to bill it out, effectively, we're giving them a 17-year
Right.
repayment window. That's a great hardship relief, but it's a bad cash flow problem for us.
And additionally, the longer you go out on our debt, excuse me, on our debt repayment, the higher the likelihood that you're going to get a default, too.
Yeah, because your risk is there.
That's a good point.
I appreciate the workshop because these are discussions that, when we talk about the CIP in November and you feel like you're under the gun, you don't have time to do these things. So I really appreciate the policy issues that are coming up, management policy. Just, how the heck are we going to balance it, getting direction on where we go? This is where I think this has been really valuable to staff. We are going to have to make some of those tough decisions that which street projects are not going to get done, which ones need to get done. I was talking to staff today because the public property improvements, we've had a program where we've put a set amount for HVAC and roof improvements by $500,000. We've done that because in the past, departments have all submitted these requests, and either the city manager or even the council is stuck saying, which roof is leaking the most? And that's putting you in a very awkward position. We changed that to say, we're going to put $500,000 a year in, and then we're going to evaluate these projects, and everybody gets it now. They understand that the worst roof gets done first. Leakiest gets the leaky wheel gets the new roof. And next week, the roof of the museum is going to start getting fixed. Because why? That was the one that came highest to the list. Similarly, parking lot projects. Which parking lots are the worst? Which ones are the highest priority? Downtown area type of area. Those parking lots get done first. But every parking lot's in the list. So projects or programs like that have really gotten the departments to think collectively. But the only way we're going to keep that collective thinking is we need to put $500,000 into the HVAC and roof improvement program. We need to put $350,000 or more into the parking lot program. The reality is to make this balance, I'm probably going to have to shave it back. I don't want to get rid of it completely, but I may have to shave it back. Why? Because I got to get down to $12.6 million. So maybe roof goes to $300,000, and maybe a parking lot goes to $200,000. Maybe we don't borrow for it this year. Those are all the complicating factors that we're ultimately going to have to make before we give you a formal CIP budget. When you get a CIP budget as opposed to a plan, the numbers are going to have to reflect our ability to pay.
Would you set aside money, sort of the set aside of that money, the $500,000 or whatever? I would rather see it reduced than eliminated. It's sort of like a savings plan in a given year. You say, I'm going to save $1,000 a year in a certain kind of account or whatever, and that goes in there and you say it. But some year you have a really bad year. You're better off even putting $100 in there than going to zero, because the minute you go to zero, you've lost your plan.
The best
So I would rather, as I say, I'd rather see some of those cut back some.
The best
than
example.
taking something to zero, because I think then you've thrown it out the window.
The best example we have is in the operating budget. Chief Groyle and I have gone over his operating budget for next year, and we were teasing Mr. Noakes a little bit because back in '04, you remember Chief talking about every squad car was cut from his budget, and you could see his maintenance budget go up and up and up. I'm happy to report that the chief, and we were up at $75,000, even $80,000 in some years, were his costs for maintenance. As a result of council's commitment to replace the squad cars when they should be replaced, his maintenance budget's going to be down to $45,000 this year. So we've saved $25,000 just by getting back on a schedule and not saying we're going to throw the whole thing out, because when you throw the whole thing out, it's that maintenance, and the maintenance is killing you. $25,000 a year we're saving because we're making prudent decisions on replacing squad cars. And of course, the chief is using that against me now because he wants to make sure squad cars don't get cut in the operating budget. But it's the same thing. If we don't put an allowance towards roof repairs and an allowance towards parking lot repairs, that stuff just catches up with you eventually. So trim it, but don't eliminate it.
It sounds like you've already identified.
Like streets. Thank you, David. I knew you were going to mention that.
It sounds like you've already identified the projects, whether they be HVAC or roof repairs or parking lots. You've already identified the priority items, so if you have to cut down to something, you know, is the absolute ones that you say, yes, this year, this has to get done no matter what, because you've got to fix a leaky roof, because if you don't fix the leaky roof, then the next thing you know, then you have to
Replace the whole roof.
insulation, then you have to replace walls, and then you have to replace this, and so,
You got a grand opera house. That's what happens.
But I think as we're starting to reach consensus on certain items, that we don't want to see things completely eliminated. We want to see them reduced accordingly. You guys seem to have a plan of attack when it comes to prioritizing. And I'm with Councilor Peck about, let's hold the line and not panic. But let's not spend like it's going out of style either. I think we have to, let's be prudent, let's be smart, and let's take a measured approach to it.
let's be frugal, not cheap.
Yes.
Mark, can you go back from when we started at 5:30? You had mentioned something that we were gonna borrow, and within the borrowing, we were gonna be paying into something into special assessments or something. You said at the very beginning that when you and Ed had talked, you guys in the borrowing were gonna do something.
Go back and
I
see.
thought
if
you
it-
like borrowing extra for.
That we may have to cover a cash flow balance.
Oh,
Cash
for
flow
ca-
problem, yeah.
I view that as something that we'll probably need to do throughout 2014. I don't anticipate it's going to be part of this. I would say the new finance director is going to be given a task of, we need to, I said audit, I later changed it to reconcile. We need to reconcile where our special assessment fund is. I don't think we're going to be able to do in this short order, but I think that's something that is going to need to be a priority for the new finance director. Peggy and I talked about that. She was very concerned about, and it wasn't just because of the cash flow issue, it was just in general that we hadn't done it in a while, and Ed had mentioned to her when he was mentoring her 5 years ago that you got to take a look at special assessment fund to see how it's doing. You may need to go and
So we'd be borrowing extra in the GO to basically put cash in special assessments. But is there, maybe I'm thinking of revenue bonds, but isn't there certain things like you have to borrow and it has to be specific and it can't be extra for cash, otherwise there's like a penalty?
we could borrow for something like that. That's, as long as we borrow it for its intended purpose. The intended purpose would be to fund special assessments. That would be appropriate.
But that falls under a category that can be without penalty.
Where you get into penalties if you borrow money and you don't
Use it.
spend it, so to speak. You
Right,
can't
and that's-
arbitrage. You can't
Exactly, and that's
borrow,
where I'm
you
going
can't borrow
with.
money at
We can't borrow.
R3% and then try and invest it at 5%.
If you could find it, I'd look at it.
Well, that's.
The other issue is we can't take, say we borrow for the central garage project and then decide, oh, we're going to use it for
Right.
street improvements. You can't do that.
Okay,
Um,
so we're not
With
suggesting.
bonds, you don't have
anything.
that.
Okay.
With notes, you have a little more flexibility. The 10-year notes, just the way the federal rules are written, you have some flexibility to move around. When you get into the bonds, there's a lot of very strict, and they actually are based in the arbitrage requirements, but,
Well, why wouldn't we do a note then instead of a bond if we're looking to just
oh, that's very possible.
to do a bridge? Because that's really all it is. I mean, that's what the note is for, is to bridge a cash flow issue.
We haven't gotten to that level of detail. The answer is you're probably right. That's what we would do. And, as opposed to the long-term obligation that we would love to do for WRS, that would likely be a 20-year repayment because it's a longer-term obligation. That I would suggest if we were able to get to that point. But we're not going to be able to get to that point until we get that percentage down. Until we get those percentages down, then we can start having that discussion. But those are the, what do we do with, do we need to make special assessment fund a little more cash rich? Do we do the WRS? Do we get rid of that unfunded liability that's been hanging over our heads for years now?
So do we, I'm sorry, Hal. Just the last question I had is, do we have any idea based on what we got back from those that were assessed that Pam gets in, where it's kind of an indication of are they going to pay all at once, are they going to pay, whatever. Do we have any type of idea, like a estimated projection of money in then
You
from?
I think the answer is yes. Ed just brought that to my attention today, because some of those ones I'm not necessarily privy to, but Ed, you were mentioning to me something that Pam's done in the past.
Pam ran a report today, and this, I'm sure, does not have any of the new contracts that have come down recently from Dave. But if we ran the transfer to tax roll tomorrow, we would transfer $760,000 worth of principal and another $269,000 of interest into the special assessment fund. Or that's what would transfer to the tax roll and come in next year.
Okay, so that's
the
a
answer,
projection of
yes.
what we'd have
Yeah.
coming.
Yeah, because I just recently had to send in my notice, and I had to tell the city if I'm going to pay off my street improvement all or take out 10-year, 15-year.
I know, I think Cold Mix, I think you have only had the 5-year program.
That's
Oh,
true.
But you have the
But you're,
pay.
the city's going to get their money. I'm paying it up front. Hey,
So this will likely,
I'm going to be a nice guy. I'm paying it up front.
This is my friend.
Saving on interest payments.
so that'll undoubtedly go up
5%
because the new ones are coming on, but at this point, that's what we have.
You know, something that has not been discussed tonight, though, is there's two sides to every equation. And if we can drive that equalized value up, we will also drive down that other one. So economic development is a big priority that we can focus on. I mean, we can't just focus on the debt. Yes, we need to focus on the debt side. We can't solely have everything lasered in on the debt side. We need to also figure a way to try and drive that equalized value.
Which is also tied into Steve's neighborhood programs, so I keep it,
Equity protection.
because we get some, one of our problems is we have a declining
Right.
housing stock value, and so.
And
That's
so
important
everything
over
we
there.
can do to drive that up.
And grow ourselves out of the
Helps us.
problem, too.
Well, yeah, it's a little harder to grow out than it is to watch the debt, but you can still make good chunk.
Yeah, you can see, just taking a look at, the denominator was only, it really is pretty stagnant, but if you can get some impact on that equalized value, you could see what would happen, and all we would have to do is, just play with that model right there and just up that number. What would happen if we had a 5% increase? Well, it's not likely in the next year or two, but yeah, that would absolutely have some positive outcomes. The reality is you borrow less, you got fewer problems, but you get a combination of property value enhancement, and you start holding the line on borrowing, you get the double effect, which is really the ideal situation.
I know we've been focused on the general obligation debt tonight, but if we go back to this legal size handout that you gave us that has our percentage of debt limit and our general fund percentage of debt limit, there's about an 18 to 20% difference there. So we're still looking at our utility debt is not something that we can ignore, and it's something that, well, a lot of that is based on the willingness to raise rates. There's going to be instances where we're going to run up against how much will people bear on a monthly basis or on a quarterly basis when we bill them for their utilities, and that will, in essence, limit borrowing on that side. So when we're looking at the debt as a whole, we still have to account for utility debt in this picture. And if we are going to reduce utility debt, that necessarily means we have to slow down on projects.
And Counselor Clark was kind enough to give me advance notice he was going to make that point. I'm passing out something that the council has received before, but it just kind of goes to that point with respect to the utilities. What I'm sending you is the Moody's report for our June 2013 stormwater utility revenue bonds. And there's a lot of things you can read in here, but what I would, it's the negative outlook, which was really something that was bothersome both to Peggy and me as we were looking at it. This was the second year that the negative outlook was given. About three-quarters of the way down under the heading Summary Rating Rationale, the second paragraph, it talks about the negative outlook. The negative outlook reflects our expectation that the utilities debt ratio will remain elevated in the coming years due to expected future borrowing. What they mean, they know we're going to be borrowing more, and if we don't keep raising our rates, we're going to have a negative debt ratio, meaning it falls below the standards that they have. The negative outlook also reflects our expectation that overall coverage will remain narrow and possibly, and that's their concern, fall to below some sufficient if management is unable or unwilling to continue to substantially increase rates. In this case, they consider you part of the management team. It's if I come to you and say, we need to raise rates by 10%, and you say, no, the ratio falls below, and then they say, it's not just a negative outlook, now we're going to lower your bond rating because you're not meeting it. And the minute you're below that ratio, you're probably going to continue to get a continued downturn until you prove yourself otherwise. That's what they're concerned about, because the way I described it to them was, we are doing a just-in-time increase. We're not going to increase rates just for the sake of increasing rates. We're going to increase rates when we need to cover our debt ratios. They're concerned that a council or a city manager could say, well, we're not going to do that anymore because we're going to get too much flack. And you know that you get flack whenever you raise rates. That, unfortunately, is the sad part of your job. And if you were compelled so much not to raise the rates and affect the debt ratio, then we're in trouble. The same principle applies to stormwater, or to sanitary sewer utility, water utility, but the sanitary sewer utility, because we've invested, $50, $60 million over the past few years, this is the one that's standing out the most. And I know Councilor Clark, from being on the Stormwater Committee, has a particular affinity for this concern.
Does the State Public Service Commission have any oversight if they're, I guess, on rate increases to the stormwater utility in the same manner that they would with either the water utility or wastewater utility?
Water only.
Just water.
PSC's only on water. This is all on you guys.
Okay.
And again, I said it earlier tonight, services come with a cost.
The point I'm making here is, we can't just assume that one thing is moving in a vacuum. The point was made before that the bond rating companies look at this as a whole. They look at who else is assessing debt to our constituents, and this is one other thing that we can't forget, because if we keep the stormwater utility in the last year had to approve a double-digit rate increase. If we're going to have to continue doing that, that's going to be coming out of people's pockets, and that severely limits our ability to do other things.
And you just have to remember, you can say it's a double digit, and I understand that $25 over a whole year to some people may seem like a lot of money, but we are getting a lot of input from people who would gladly spend the $25 so that they don't have flooding.
Well, sure, obviously. Yeah.
And I mean, if you're going from $10 to $12, that's a 20% increase. You're going from $20 to $21.
I don't have the numbers in front of me, but
it's a determination of what your base is as well as your increase. And yes, there is nothing that's mutually exclusive. But again, substitute the word taxes for services, and it takes on a lot different connotation. Nobody likes taxes. Most everybody likes services. When they flush their toilet, they want to make sure that the sewage goes away. When it rains, they want to make sure that their, as Dave indicated, the basement is not flooding. When they're driving down the street, they don't want their car to disappear.
and that is our responsibility to balance.
Okay, do you guys want to make any final comments? I'll see if people
Mark, did you get you have the directions you were looking for? Because I think there were only two of us that chimed in.
We didn't have to pick a number today, though, right? Or we do have to pick a
I don't
number
think you have to
today?
pick a number, but I think, where I'm leaning is presenting you with a CIP budget that pretty much reflects footnote number 2.
Would agree.
That's the ballpark I'm looking at. That doesn't take us anywhere better, but it doesn't take us anywhere worse than we are right now. I think we need to hold serve on this but we still have to exercise some restraint. It gives us some flexibility, but doesn't give us everything we want either. That's what we're going to have to figure out.
The only thing I'd add to that is that, part of this is a city garage. It's been big last year, big this year, and we think future's going to go down. My hope is that over time, we can begin to move that number down. I mean, that's really kind of been,
Yeah.
the goal for some time. But I don't think we can, as long as we have the city garage obligation and the other needs in the community, it's not going to happen.
But sometimes I guess my thought process was back when we approved the city garage, it was kind of like sometimes you're going to have a major purchase, but you may have to sacrifice some things in order to do that, priorities. And I guess at that time, I guess I had thought, knowing that was something major and significant, we were going to do that, but we may have to scale back on some things. That was my thought. So I don't know that I necessarily agree with 2. I'm not saying I don't, but I'm not saying I do either, and that's why I would appreciate not having to give an answer tonight, because there's more things to consider. And to Tom's point, I understand what Tom's saying in regards to, you don't want to necessarily focus on the debt, but again, we also have to look at how this debt has affected us cash flow in the operating budget. So I just want to think on it. I want to sleep on it.
Any other final comments? Steve, did you have anything? You really haven't spoken up, so I didn't know if you have a strong thought or anything. John, you've been quiet or two. Any final comments?
Just absorbing and asking
Anything?
questions that come along. No.
Anybody else?
Thank you.
Hey, if not, it is 7:30. I do appreciate people coming. We do have more meetings coming up at the next 2 meetings in October. Those are the longer meetings. We will be meeting in this room. There will be pizza on those nights if there was confusion tonight. The longer meetings, we'll have it. They'll be available half an hour before the meeting, so that's my
Food and my stomach, I'll
responsibility.
talk more.
Again, thanks.
But I think it
we
probably
will
does
see you.
add up to this
Thank you
one.
very much.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Ed.